they buried more than my husband. The morning of my husband's funeral, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror fastening the small pearl earrings Richard had given me on our 25th anniversary. My hands were steady, but they felt older than they had only a week before. Grief has a way of adding years overnight. Outside my bedroom window, the sky over Columbus, Ohio, was the soft gray color that always reminded Richard of autumn football Sundays. He used to joke that even the clouds dressed respectfully when someone good left this world. I almost smiled at the memory before the silence inside the house reminded me that he would never say those things again. After 43 years of marriage, I was preparing to attend the funeral of the only man who had ever made every ordinary day feel safe. I adjusted the black jacket over my dress and picked up the folded funeral program Rebecca had emailed to everyone the night before. My name wasn't listed anywhere. I told myself it was simply an oversight. Grief makes people forget details. That was what I wanted to believe. Daniel had barely answered my calls since his father passed away 5 days earlier. Every conversation had been short, polite, almost rehearsed. He always said Rebecca was handling the arrangements because she was better at organizing events. It sounded reasonable, yet every word left a strange emptiness inside me. Richard had always told our son that family was never an event to organize. It was a promise to protect. I looked around the bedroom one last time before leaving. Richard's reading glasses still rested on the nightstand beside the novel he would never finish. His favorite navy sweater remained folded neatly across the chair where he had left it after coming home from dinner with friends only 2 weeks ago. Nothing in the room looked different except the unbearable absence that filled every corner. The drive to the church took just under 20 minutes. Every traffic light seemed to last forever. Familiar streets suddenly looked unfamiliar without Richard commenting on old buildings or pointing out restaurants he wanted to visit someday. I parked beneath a large maple tree whose leaves had just begun changing color. Families dressed in black walked quietly toward the entrance, speaking in gentle voices. I recognized neighbors, former coworkers, cousins I hadn't seen in years. Several smiled kindly when they saw me. Their sympathy gave me enough strength to keep walking. As I climbed the church steps, I noticed Rebecca standing near the entrance greeting guests with a composed smile that disappeared the moment her eyes met mine. Daniel stood beside her, wearing the dark suit Richard had bought him years ago. My son looked exhausted, but he didn't move toward me. He didn't even smile. Rebecca stepped directly into my path before I reached the doors. Her voice remained calm, almost pleasant, as though she were discussing the weather instead of changing the course of my life forever. "Margaret," she said softly, "Dad didn't want you here anymore. You're no longer part of his family." Daniel lowered his eyes. He never said a single word. I looked at both of them for several long seconds, searching for the son I had raised, but all I found was silence. I did not answer Rebecca. I did not argue with Daniel. I simply looked past them toward the sanctuary where I knew Richard's casket rested beneath white lilies he always claimed were too expensive to buy unless someone else insisted. For a brief moment, I wondered whether he would have laughed softly at the irony that the flowers he never wanted were now welcoming everyone except the woman who had shared his life. Then I turned around and walked back down the stone steps without another word. I heard whispers behind me, but I kept my eyes fixed on the parking lot. Every step felt strangely calm, as though my body had accepted something my heart had not yet understood. By the time I reached my car, the church bells began ringing. Their familiar sound echoed across the neighborhood exactly, as they had on our wedding day more than 4 decades earlier. I sat behind the steering wheel, without starting the engine. My hands rested quietly on my lap while memories drifted through my mind one after another. 48 hours earlier, everything had still seemed painfully normal. The house had been unbearably quiet after Richard passed away in his sleep, yet I kept following the routines we had built together over 43 years. Every morning I brewed 2 cups of coffee before remembering there was no one sitting across from me anymore. I still opened the kitchen curtains because Richard loved watching the sunrise spill across the backyard. I still filled the bird feeder because he always insisted the cardinals depended on us more than we realized. Those tiny habits were all I had left. Daniel had visited only once after his father's passing. He hugged me politely, stayed less than 20 minutes, and spent most of that time answering messages on his phone while Rebecca discussed funeral schedules from the dining room table as if she were organizing a business conference. Whenever I offered an opinion about the service, she smiled kindly before changing the subject. At first, I convinced myself she was simply overwhelmed. Grief affects everyone differently, I reminded myself. Looking back now, I realized she had never asked what Richard would have wanted. She only spoke about efficiency, timing, seating charts, and guest lists. That afternoon, after they left, I wandered into Richard's workshop behind the garage. The scent of cedar would still lingered in the air. Half-finished birdhouses lined the shelves beside neatly labeled jars of screws and nails. His reading glasses rested on the workbench beside a yellow legal pad covered with his familiar handwriting. At the top of the page, he had written 3 simple words: "Finish what matters." Underneath was a short list of household repairs, birthday reminders for the grandchildren, and a note to replace the porch swing before next spring. Nothing about money. Nothing about property. Nothing about possessions. Richard had always believed people mattered more than things. I traced my fingers lightly across the page before folding it carefully into my purse. I did not know why I kept it. Perhaps I simply needed something that still carried the warmth of his ordinary life. As I finally started my car outside the church, I realized something far more painful than being turned away had settled inside me. Rebecca had spoken with confidence because she believed the story was already finished. Daniel had remained silent because he believed there was nothing left worth saying. Neither of them understood that the truth rarely reveals itself during the loudest moment. Sometimes it waits patiently until everyone else believes the conversation is over. I drove home instead of wandering aimlessly through the city because Richard had always believed that difficult days should end where your heart felt safest. The house greeted me with the same deep silence I had left behind that morning. I placed my purse on the kitchen counter, removed my black jacket, and stood for several minutes looking through the window above the sink. The bird feeder swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. 2 cardinals landed beside a curious blue jay exactly as they had almost every day for years. Richard used to call them our most faithful visitors because they never forgot where they belonged. I wondered if people could learn something from birds. They never seemed interested in taking more than they needed. They simply arrived, shared the space, and flew away together. My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of tires rolling slowly across the gravel driveway. I glanced outside expecting Daniel, but instead I saw an older silver pickup truck that I recognized immediately. Harold Bennett climbed out wearing the same brown felt hat he had worn every fall since I first met him nearly 30 years ago. Harold and Richard had been friends long before I entered Richard's life. They had worked together, hunted together every November, and spent countless Saturdays repairing fences, helping neighbors, or drinking coffee while arguing about baseball. Harold removed his hat respectfully when I opened the front door. His eyes were heavy with sadness. "I heard what happened at the church," he said quietly. I invited him inside without asking who had told him because news always traveled quickly through a town like ours. We sat at the kitchen table where Richard and Harold had shared hundreds of conversations. Neither of us spoke for almost a full minute. Finally, Harold folded his weathered hands together and looked directly at me. "Richard was worried," he said. Those 3 words caught my attention immediately. "Worried about what?" I asked. Harold hesitated as though carefully choosing each word. "Not about dying." He accepted that long before anyone else did. He was worried about what would happen after he was gone. My heartbeat slowed. Richard had never been afraid to discuss difficult subjects, but he had never mentioned concerns about our family. Harold reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, but stopped before pulling anything out. Instead, he sighed. About 6 months ago, he asked me a strange question. He wanted to know what kind of person keeps smiling while quietly taking everything from someone else. I stared at Harold in disbelief because those words sounded exactly like something Richard would ask when he had already figured out the answer. Harold continued speaking in the same calm voice. "He told me not to interfere unless you truly needed help. He said you would know when the right time came." I felt a chill despite the warm afternoon sunlight filling the kitchen. Did he say who he was talking about? Harold nodded slowly, but did not answer immediately. He glanced toward the family photographs displayed along the dining room wall. There was one picture of Daniel graduating from college with Richard proudly standing beside him while Rebecca smiled at the edge of the frame. Harold looked back at me with quiet regret. "He never blamed Daniel," he said softly. "He believed your son loved both of you. But he also believed someone had slowly taught him to confuse loyalty with obedience." I lowered my eyes to the table as every uncomfortable conversation from the past year began fitting together like pieces of a puzzle I had refused to solve. Harold finally reached into his jacket and rested a sealed cream-colored envelope on the table between us. He did not slide it toward me. He simply placed his hand on top of it and said, "Richard asked me to protect this until the day you needed to stop doubting yourself. I believe that day has finally arrived." I looked at the envelope for several long seconds before reaching for it. The cream-colored paper had yellowed slightly around the edges, and my name was written across the front in Richard's careful handwriting. He had always formed every letter slowly, believing that anything important deserved patience. My fingers trembled as I traced the familiar ink, not because I feared what was inside, but because seeing his handwriting again felt like hearing his voice from another room. Harold quietly stood and walked toward the living room, giving me the privacy he knew I needed. I broke the seal carefully, unwilling to damage something Richard had prepared with such intention. Inside was a folded letter and a smaller envelope marked, "Only if Margaret begins to doubt herself." I unfolded the first page. Richard's words were exactly as I remembered them, calm, thoughtful, and free of anger. He wrote that if I was reading the letter, then events had unfolded exactly as he had feared. He apologized for not telling me everything while he was alive, explaining that he had hoped love and common sense would prove him wrong. Instead, he had watched subtle changes inside our family that became impossible for him to ignore. He described evenings when Daniel stopped calling without Rebecca reminding him, holidays that suddenly became difficult to schedule, and simple family dinners where my opinions quietly disappeared from the conversation. None of those moments seemed dramatic on their own, but together they formed a pattern that troubled him deeply. Richard admitted that he had questioned himself many times. He wondered whether age had made him overly suspicious or whether grief over his declining health had clouded his judgment. Then he wrote one sentence that made me close my eyes. "Manipulation rarely arrives shouting. It whispers until good people mistake silence for peace." I remembered countless occasions when Rebecca answered questions directed at Daniel before he could speak for himself. I remembered birthdays that changed without explanation, weekend visits canceled at the last minute, and family decisions announced only after they had already been made. Each event had seemed too small to challenge. Together, they had quietly redrawn the boundaries of our family without either Richard or me realizing how much ground we had already lost. The next page revealed something even more surprising. Richard explained that nearly 8 months earlier, he had met privately with our attorney, Thomas Green. He had reviewed every document connected to our home, retirement accounts, savings, and family trust. He wanted to make certain that no misunderstanding or outside pressure could ever separate me from the life we had built together. He wrote that true protection was not measured by wealth, but by clarity. Every legal document had been updated to remove uncertainty and prevent manipulation after his passing. He ended the letter with words that blurred through my tears. "Margaret, if someone tries to convince you that you no longer belong, remember this. A marriage of 43 years cannot be erased by a single conversation at a church door. Our life together is not theirs to rewrite." I carefully folded the pages and placed them back inside the envelope before opening the smaller one. Inside was a single handwritten note containing only one sentence. "When the time is right, call Thomas before speaking to anyone else." Nothing more.
No explanations. No dramatic instructions.
Just quiet confidence. I looked toward Harold, who had been standing respectfully by the living room window without interrupting me. He nodded gently before I even spoke. "Thomas has been expecting your call," he said. "Richard asked him to wait until you were ready, because he believed you would need the truth more than revenge." For the first time since Richard closed his eyes forever, I felt something stronger than grief begin settling inside me. It was not anger. It was certainty. I waited until Harold drove away before making the call. The afternoon sun stretched across the hardwood floor, casting long golden lines through the living room windows Richard had installed himself almost 20 years earlier. I sat in his favorite armchair with the envelope resting beside me, took one slow breath, and dialed Thomas Green's office. His receptionist answered politely, but the moment I introduced myself, her tone softened. She asked me to hold for only a few seconds before Thomas came on the line. "Margaret," he said gently, "I've been hoping to hear your voice." There was no surprise in his words, only quiet reassurance. He did not ask how I was feeling because he already knew the answer. Instead, he asked a simple question. "Are you somewhere comfortable?" I looked around the home Richard and I had built together, one careful decision at a time. Every photograph, every bookshelf, every piece of furniture carried memories that could never appear on a legal document. "Yes," I answered. "I am home." Thomas remained silent for a moment before speaking again. Richard trusted that answer more than any other. He explained that my husband had met with him several times during the previous year. At first, they discussed routine estate planning after Richard received difficult news about his health. Later, their conversations became more detailed. Richard had noticed subtle changes in the family dynamic that troubled him. He never accused anyone directly, but he wanted every document reviewed with extraordinary care. Thomas told me Richard insisted that every decision be transparent, legally sound, and impossible to misinterpret. He kept repeating the same sentence, Thomas recalled. He said that people reveal who they are when they believe there will be no consequences. I listened quietly while Thomas continued. He explained that no final reading of the estate had been scheduled because several documents required my presence before any distributions or transfers could legally begin. Without me, nothing substantial could move forward. The realization settled over me slowly. Rebecca had acted as though everything had already been decided, yet according to Thomas, the legal process had barely begun. "There is something else you should know," he said. "Richard requested that I delay contacting anyone except you until after the memorial service. He believed emotions would cloud everyone's judgment during those first few days." I remembered Rebecca speaking with such confidence outside the church, convinced she had already closed every door behind me. Thomas's next words explained why Richard had remained so calm during his final months. He prepared for misunderstanding, Margaret. He did not prepare for conflict. There is an important difference. He invited me to his office the following morning, not to argue with anyone, not to challenge anyone, simply to review every document exactly as Richard intended. Before ending the call, I hesitated. "Thomas," I asked quietly, "did Richard ever say whether he blamed Daniel?" The attorney answered without hesitation, "Never. He believed your son had lost confidence in his own judgment. Richard hoped that truth, once revealed, would give him the opportunity to find it again." After we said goodbye, I remained seated with the telephone still in my hand. The house no longer felt empty in quite the same way. Richard was gone, and nothing could change that heartbreaking fact. Yet every careful step he had taken before leaving this world reminded me that love is sometimes expressed through preparation rather than promises. Later that evening, my phone lit up with a message from Daniel. It was only 6 words long. "We need to discuss the house tomorrow." I read the sentence twice before placing the phone face down on the coffee table. For the first time since everything had unraveled, I did not feel pressured to answer immediately. Tomorrow would come soon enough, and for once, I was no longer walking into it unprepared. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Rebecca's calm voice telling me that I no longer belonged. Yet instead of filling me with anger, the memory reminded me of Richard's letter. Manipulation whispers until good people mistake silence for peace. I woke before sunrise and followed the routine that had carried me through every difficult season of my marriage. I brewed fresh coffee, opened the kitchen curtains, and watched the first light settle across the backyard. The porch swing Richard had promised to replace before spring moved gently in the morning breeze. I smiled sadly, realizing there would never be another chance for him to finish that small promise. At exactly 8:30, my telephone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice sounded tired, almost uncertain. Mom, Rebecca and I are coming by around 10. We need to go over some things about the house. I noticed he never asked whether it was a good time. He spoke as though a decision had already been made. What things? I asked quietly. There was a short pause before he replied. It is probably best if we start preparing the property for sale. A place this large is going to be too much for you. The sentence felt strangely familiar because Rebecca had used almost the same words before the memorial service. They had repeated the idea so often that perhaps Daniel no longer recognized it as someone else's opinion. I already have plans this morning, I answered calmly. We can talk another day. Another silence followed. Then Rebecca's voice suddenly appeared in the background, loud enough for me to hear, even though she was clearly speaking to Daniel instead of me. Tell her we cannot keep waiting forever. Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly. Mom, this affects everyone. I looked around the kitchen where every cabinet had been chosen together with Richard, where pencil marks on the pantry door still measured Daniel's height from elementary school through high school, where countless birthdays, Thanksgiving dinners, and ordinary Tuesday evenings had quietly become the story of our family. No, I said gently. It affects all of us differently. Before either of them could answer, I wished Daniel a peaceful morning and ended the call. Less than an hour later, I parked outside Thomas Green's office in a brick building overlooking the town square. Richard had brought me there years earlier, when we signed the papers for our first will. Walking through the front door felt oddly comforting. Thomas greeted me personally instead of sending an assistant. He led me into his conference room where several neatly organized folders rested on the polished oak table. There was nothing dramatic about the room. No sense of confrontation. Only quiet order. Thomas opened the first folder and carefully explained every document Richard had updated. The family home had never belonged solely to Richard. Decades earlier, after paying off the mortgage, they had legally changed ownership into a form that guaranteed the surviving spouse full rights without interruption. There was no legal path allowing anyone else to sell, transfer, or claim the property without my direct approval. Thomas then showed me another document establishing a family trust that Richard had amended months before his passing. The revisions required several conditions to be met before any inheritance could be distributed. One condition stood above all the others. Every beneficiary was expected to participate in a private family meeting conducted in good faith before any assets could change hands. Richard had even written a personal statement explaining that respect within a family mattered as much as any financial gift. Thomas closed the folder and folded his hands together. Rebecca believes this process is almost finished, he said quietly. In reality, Margaret, it has not even officially begun. Thomas slid one final folder across the table but did not open it immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me with the same calm expression Richard always appreciated in people. There is one meeting that must happen before anything else, he said. Richard requested that everyone hear his final statement together. He believed no one should receive only part of the truth. I nodded quietly. Somehow I already knew Richard would never leave unfinished words behind. Thomas explained that notices had already been sent asking Daniel and Rebecca to meet at his office the following afternoon. They believed it was a routine estate conference. Only Thomas and I knew there was much more waiting inside those folders. Before I left, he handed me copies of several documents and encouraged me to read them only if I wanted reassurance. You do not need these papers to defend yourself, he said. You only need them to remind yourself that Richard trusted you completely. As I drove home, I realized something had changed inside me. I was no longer rehearsing imaginary arguments with Rebecca or wondering why Daniel had remained silent outside the church. I could not rewrite what had happened there. I could only decide how I would walk into tomorrow. When I reached the house, Daniel's truck was already parked in the driveway. Rebecca stood beside him with her arms folded neatly across her jacket. They both turned as I stepped out of my car. Daniel approached first. Mom, we have been waiting almost 30 minutes. His voice sounded strained, somewhere between frustration and uncertainty. Rebecca offered a polite smile that never reached her eyes. We really should settle everything quickly, she said. There is no reason to delay practical decisions. I unlocked the front door and invited them inside without responding. The familiar scent of coffee and cedar still lingered in the house. Daniel glanced around the living room while Rebecca studied the furniture with surprising attention, as though mentally rearranging a place she already considered hers. She placed a thin stack of papers on the dining room table. "These are contact details for a real estate agent," she explained. "He specializes in homes like this one. The market is strong right now." Daniel nodded. "It is probably the smartest financial move." I looked at the papers, but made no effort to pick them up. Instead, I poured 3 cups of coffee exactly as Richard always had when guests visited. Rebecca declined. Daniel accepted without meeting my eyes. The silence stretched gently between us until I finally spoke. "I met with Thomas Green this morning." Rebecca's confident expression flickered for only a fraction of a second before returning to normal. "That makes sense," she replied smoothly. "He probably explained the probate process." "He explained much more than that," I answered. Daniel looked up immediately. "What do you mean?" I rested my hands around the warm coffee cup and spoke as calmly as Richard would have. "He explained that nothing concerning this house, the trust, or your father's estate can move forward yet." Rebecca laughed softly, almost dismissively. "That is probably just legal paperwork. These things always take time." I held her gaze without raising my voice. "Tomorrow afternoon Thomas has asked all of us to meet together. He said your father left instructions that everyone should hear at the same time." The room became noticeably quieter. Daniel frowned with genuine confusion. "Dad never mentioned another meeting." "He planned it months ago," I replied. Rebecca reached for the real estate papers and slowly gathered them back into her folder. For the first time since Richard passed away, she seemed unsure of her next sentence. As they prepared to leave, Daniel paused at the front door. He looked back at me with tired eyes that reminded me of the little boy who used to ask his father how to fix broken bicycles. "Mom," he said quietly, "is there something I do not know?" I watched him for a long moment before answering. "I believe tomorrow, your father is finally going to answer that question for all of us." The following afternoon arrived with clear skies and a cool breeze that carried the first signs of fall across the town square. I parked outside Thomas Green's office a few minutes early, just as Richard always had whenever something truly mattered. He believed arriving calmly was a form of respect, not only for other people, but for yourself. I sat in my car for a brief moment, looking at the courthouse across the street where Richard and I had renewed our wedding vows on our 40th anniversary during a community celebration. We had laughed that day because the judge accidentally called us newlyweds. Neither of us bothered correcting him. Those memories steadied me as I walked inside. Thomas welcomed me with a warm handshake before leading me into the same conference room. A long polished table stood in the center with 4 chairs already arranged. Richard's neatly labeled folders rested beside each seat. Nothing about the room suggested confrontation. It felt more like a place where truth had been patiently waiting. A few minutes later, Daniel and Rebecca arrived together. Daniel looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped beneath the navy jacket he had worn at the memorial service. Rebecca entered with careful confidence, offering polite greetings before sitting beside him. Thomas waited until everyone was settled before speaking. "Thank you for coming." Richard Collins left very specific instructions regarding today's meeting. My responsibility is simply to carry out those instructions exactly as he requested. Rebecca nodded politely. "We understand. We are hoping everything can move forward efficiently." Thomas acknowledged her comment with a slight smile but continued without responding directly. He opened the first folder and reviewed the legal structure of the estate, explaining each document with careful precision. Daniel listened closely while Rebecca occasionally glanced toward me, perhaps expecting some emotional reaction that never came. When Thomas confirmed that the family home remained entirely under my legal control, Daniel's forehead tightened with confusion. Rebecca shifted slightly in her chair, but remained silent. Thomas then opened another folder containing Richard's personal statement. Richard requested that these words be read aloud before any discussion of inheritance or property. The room grew perfectly still. Thomas began reading in Richard's familiar voice, or at least that was how it sounded inside my heart. Richard wrote that a family should never confuse kindness with weakness or patience with surrender. He explained that every gift he left behind carried one expectation, that those receiving it would treat one another with dignity after he was gone. He wrote that money could repair houses but never relationships, and that respect shown during moments of grief revealed a person's true character more clearly than years of pleasant conversation. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the table. Rebecca remained motionless, though the confidence she had carried into the room slowly disappeared. Then Thomas unfolded one final handwritten page. Richard requested this paragraph be read, without interruption. He continued, "If Margaret is ever made to feel like an outsider in the home we built together or within the family we raised together, I ask that every beneficiary stop and examine not her place in this family, but their own. The greatest inheritance I leave behind is not this house or these accounts. It is the example of how we choose to love each other when it is no longer convenient." No one spoke after the reading ended. Even the quiet hum of the air conditioner seemed louder than before. Daniel looked across the table at me for the first time since his father passed away. His expression was no longer defensive. It was filled with the painful realization that his father had seen everything long before anyone else had understood it. Rebecca slowly folded her hands together, but for the first time since this painful journey began, she had nothing left to say. No one moved for several seconds after Thomas finished reading Richard's final words. The silence did not feel uncomfortable. It felt honest. Daniel slowly rubbed his hands together, staring at the polished surface of the conference table as though he hoped it might offer a different ending. Finally, he looked at me, and for the first time in many months, I saw my son instead of a man repeating someone else's expectations. His voice was quiet when he spoke. "Mom, I should have listened to Dad. I should have listened to you." There was no dramatic apology, no attempt to erase everything that had happened outside the church. Just a simple sentence spoken with genuine regret. I nodded gently, because some wounds do not heal through long speeches. They begin healing the moment someone finally chooses the truth. Rebecca remained silent. She looked toward Thomas as though searching for another explanation, another document, another technicality that might change what she had just heard. There was none. Thomas carefully closed Richard's folders and folded his hands. "The legal matters will proceed exactly as Richard instructed," he said calmly. "There is nothing further to debate today." We all stood. Daniel hesitated before walking toward me. He looked older than he had only a week earlier. Grief had changed all of us in different ways. "Would you come home with us?" he asked softly. "I think we need to talk." I smiled with kindness, but shook my head. "Not today." He lowered his eyes and accepted my answer without argument. As I stepped outside the office building, the cool afternoon air felt lighter than it had in days. I realized that nothing Richard had prepared was designed to punish anyone. Every document, every letter, every careful instruction had been created to protect what mattered most. He understood that money could become a source of division if people forgot the values that built it in the first place. During the following weeks, life settled into a quieter rhythm. The house remained my home, just as it always had been. I repaired the porch swing Richard had wanted to replace, planted fresh flowers beside the front walkway, and continued filling the bird feeder every morning. Some habits are too meaningful to abandon. Daniel began visiting alone on Sunday afternoons. At first, our conversations were cautious, filled with long pauses and simple questions about the garden or the weather. Gradually, those visits became longer. One afternoon, he admitted that he had confused keeping peace with avoiding difficult conversations. He told me he wished he had questioned things sooner instead of assuming someone else always knew best. I told him that regret is only valuable if it teaches us to choose differently tomorrow. Rebecca never offered excuses. Several weeks later, she sent me a handwritten letter expressing regret for the pain she had caused. I appreciated the effort, but I understood that trust returns quietly, one choice at a time. I wished her well without pretending that everything had instantly become the same. Richard had once told me that forgiveness and forgetting were not identical twins. One brings peace. The other often ignores wisdom. As autumn slowly turned into winter, I found myself smiling more often than I expected. Not because I had won anything, but because I had finally stopped measuring my worth through someone else's acceptance. The moment I was told I no longer belonged became the moment I discovered that belonging was never theirs to give or take away. Richard left me something far greater than a house, a trust, or carefully prepared documents. He left me the confidence to stand quietly in the truth without raising my voice. And every morning, when the first cardinals landed outside my kitchen window, I remembered the lesson we built together over 43 years. Families are not preserved by inheritance. They are preserved by character. Everything else eventually fades.